All right, I want to talk about macroeconomic measures and some reference to international trade, beginning with the business cycle. The Great Depression was by far the worst economic crisis in U.S. history, but although the economy managed to avoid catastrophe for the rest of the 20th century, it was experiencing many ups and downs. That's just been the case throughout history, actually, and there are some unique explanations for that. One of which is the paradox of thrift. The paradox of thrift explains how when one household sees or foresees hard times approaching, they tend to change their spending and saving habits, saving more. And when this happens on an aggregate scale across an entire macroeconomy, then all of these thrifty savers end up weakening the total output and business activity within the economy. So there are ups and downs, and we're going to begin with the business cycle as an explanation of different elements of growth. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the different components of the business cycle. The national economy fluctuates, resulting in periods of boom and bust. So you can see that there is a trend line that represents economic growth over time, which, as you can see here on this graph, is real GDP per year over time. And this trend line is upward sloping. So this is typical of most macroeconomies over time. There generally is growth, of course, unless there's a recession or a really bad recession, one that lasts longer than 6 months, which is known as a depression. All right, so we have the trend line that's upward sloping. It represents gradual growth. Generally, this is about 3.5% growth. Sometimes it's indicated on the business cycle chart what percentage that is, but somewhere between 2.5% to 4% generally. The upward sloping trend line also represents full employment, which is kind of like the production possibilities curve, in that if we were on the curve, so to speak, if we were employing all available resources and maximizing our output with those resources, then we could say this is also sort of an example of that full potential, or full employment, we may call it. All right, so you can see we begin on this business cycle with an increase in real GDP until we arrive at the peak. So this is like a sound wave or something in science that you've studied before, a light wave perhaps. There's a peak and a trough, and of course, generally the problem with using the business cycle to measure economic performance is that we don't always know when we're at the peak until after we are experiencing declining real GDP. And of course, we don't really know when the recession may be ending until maybe months after, when we've had time to analyze the data to see that, okay, the worst is behind us. So upward sloping trend to the peak, down to the trough, and one business cycle, as you can see here, is inclusive of a recession and a recovery phase, or sometimes we call this a contraction and an expansion phase within the business cycle. So over time in U.S. history, you can see that there are swings in the macroeconomy as a whole, and for the last 200 years, you can see there have been great periods of expansion and growth. You can see the Gilded Age in 1880, the railroad prosperity and big business, and the rise of the corporation into the 20th century. And also, interestingly enough, you see the effects of war, World War I and World War II, the Korean War, when our economy is really amped up for production, perhaps to fight a foreign foe. Then you can see that the real GDP expands, and in some cases to extreme proportions, such as during and after the Second World War. Of course, there's also this unique effect that after wars we enter into periods of recession. So all those workers are laid off, and the economy stagnates a little bit. And of course, you see really big periods of recession and depression in the 1930s. What you cannot see are the most recent recessions occurring in 2000, late 2008, 2009. And I think today we would safely say, after GDP report in the fourth quarter last year, 5%, that we're experiencing an expansion. We're in that expansionary phase of the business cycle today. All right. Why does the economy fluctuate? Well, retailers and producers send misleading information about consumer demand. For one, it's guarded optimism, I think, that small business owners maintain. Sometimes, of course, a more optimistic attitude at the local level kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy in that, the economy's doing well, we want to believe the economy's doing well, and it could perhaps really not be doing so well. So the information is often imperfect. That's one reason. Advances in technology, productivity, or resources, anything that, of course, expand the production possibilities curve or frontier, are reasons why the business cycle may expand. You have outside influences such as shock factors that are somewhat beyond the scope of control of any government or agency. So, for instance, yesterday there was a terrorist attack in the city of Paris, and so 2 gunmen killed like a dozen people at some newspaper office. Well, you can imagine today that a lot of Parisians are paranoid. Maybe they don't want to go out and spend very much money, or they're reporting to work and they're at work and they're not being very productive. They're just talking about these events and they're all nervous. And so you can see, these events on a whole over a long period of time, terrorism, for instance, may cause decreased economic output. So we should care about these things, and macroeconomists do certainly, because measuring the fluctuations help to guide policy. And governments are able to see if we need to perhaps allocate more tax funds, or government funds, revenue and so forth, in the form of transfer payments to help out people who are maybe suffering more so during a recession than they would be ordinarily. The government has a responsibility to do 3 things, and this is a mandate that has been in effect for almost 40 years now, to promote long-term growth, to prevent unemployment, and to prevent inflation. This is the mandate, I guess, of the federal government, according to Congress, and we'll talk more about this later on. So not preventing all unemployment and not preventing all inflation, but to try to keep things in normal ranges that we would say is healthy for an economy. Okay, so during a recession or a contraction, when we're on that downward slope, you see prices, interest rates, and employment are all generally falling. And when the economy is expanding, those things change. Generally, prices rise, interest rates may also increase. The income of workers increases in the households, and GDP also increases. So these are, opposite ends of the macroeconomic spectrum here, the recession and the expansion. And you can see here in your notes, there's a nice little summary of some of the characteristics to expect during those phases of the business cycle. All right, so every quarter, there are 12 months in a year, so every 3 months, the government releases information about GDP, and this is generally done through the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, and these numbers change. Sometimes they make predictions that are off, and you can see in 2010 there was a GDP growth rate of 2.8, and as I mentioned earlier, in the last quarter of 2014 there was 5% GDP growth, which is really great considering where we've been since 2008 and 2009. So economic growth, if we were to define it, the macro economic definition involves expansion of real GDP over time. So real GDP, that word real means adjusted in economics. It's adjusted for inflation. So if gross domestic product GDP is found by multiplying the price of all final goods and services produced by the quantities of those goods and services produced, then real GDP is accounting for the effects of inflation when those prices may be distorted, reflecting macroeconomic events that would cause the money supply to increase, perhaps to cause prices to rise. So it's trying to account for the artificial growth in nominal GDP. This is what real GDP is. So an increase in real GDP per capita over time is also a pretty good economic measure. It's even more specific to a macroeconomy than real GDP because it accounts for the number of people in that society, which I think we've talked about a little bit already this semester. Why is economic growth the goal of every society? And it doesn't take a very creative person to imagine why this is a goal of every country around the world, because promoting a better standard of living is not only a way to get elected into public office, but it's generally good for mankind. All right. Lastly, the connection to the production possibilities curve. I don't have that graph here, but do recall the production possibilities curve is that simplified economic model that shows how a firm or an economy perhaps is able to expand output and production. The three shifters of the PPC all affect GDP in general, and so we want to kind of remember the connection of the business cycle to the PPC because you're able to read the same information from both. Information about full employment, with the business cycle you're looking at full employment as the trend line, and unemployment, as well as inflation. You can even see that during times of expansion in the business cycle. Inflation in the PPC, could artificially express growth by an outward shift of the PPC curve to the right. But regardless, changes in quantity or quality of resources, and changes in technology and changes in trade all impact the production possibilities curve, as well as the micro and macro, more importantly, economic climate. Okay, one last thing regarding the business cycle. The impact of the business cycle is, of course, felt everywhere in the economy. It affects different segments in different ways to different degrees. Firms and industries producing capital goods, for instance, in the U.S., the housing producers of commercial buildings, heavy equipment, farm implements, etc., and consumer durables, for example, automobiles, computers, refrigerators, and believe it or not, cell phones are considered consumer durables. These are affected most by the business cycle, so the producers of capital goods and durables for consumers. Because within limits, firms can postpone the purchase of capital goods as the economy recedes. Producers, though, frequently delay the purchase of new equipment and the construction of new plants. So the business outlook simply does not warrant increases in the stock of capital goods. In good times, in expansion of the business cycle, capital goods are usually replaced before they depreciate completely. But when recession occurs, firms will patch up their old equipment and make do just to make it through that period of recession. So as a result, investment in capital goods declines rather sharply. Firms that have excess plant capacity may not even bother to replace all the capital that is depreciating. So for them, net investment may be negative during this time of recession. When recession occurs and households trim their budgets, purchases of other goods are often deferred. So families will repair their old cars and appliances rather than buy new ones, and firms that are producing these products suffer. In contrast, the service industries and industries that produce non-durable consumer goods are somewhat insulated from the most severe effects of recession.